Okay, on this exercise, we're going to do some hand stitching, and we're going to work on some back stitches, some types of back stitches. So this is just one single rectangle, and there are no notches or anything. And what we're going to do is we're just going to use 2 plies of the muslin, and we're going to do all 3 of these back stitches. I have a back stitch, a half back stitch, and a pick stitch, and they're all considered back stitches. So we're just going to use 2 layers of muslin for a little bit more body while we stitch. So I've got my muslin here, and since this is not a real pattern for a garment, you can actually lay this flat and then do it single, but I'm just gonna go ahead and go against the rules a little bit. You got to break the rules every once in a while. Make sure this is all on grain. And I'm going to flip this over. Now, because this isn't an actual like garment piece that we've been working on, I could actually use the selvage edge if I want to. And I think I'm going to do that. Both edges are pretty straight. And then I'm just going to butt that up there. And then I will weight this down, and then I'll trace around to get this cut quickly. Now, once I get this cut out, I'll show you what your aim is. Once you get these cut out, you can, just to keep the 2 layers together, you could overlock, and I'll show you, I have overlocked mine. And this is one of those instances where it's okay to overlock your sample because you're not going to be hiding anything. You're going to be, just keeping everything together while you hand stitch your exercises. So let me cut this out really quick. And I pinned it just so that the fabric didn't move around while I was cutting. All right. So now I can take these pins out. I will probably overlock this as well around the edges. I'm not going to show that on camera. We did a little bit of overlocking in level 1, so I'm going to assume that you're okay with overlocking that. If you don't want to overlock it, you could just take a straight stitch and stitch right around here just to frame that, but don't go too far inside, maybe just a 1/4 inch from the side. So this is the actual exercise, and you can see that I've already overlocked this edge, and that looks really nice. So the 2 layers add to some of the body, which we're going to be stitching on. This is the back stitch here, the full back stitch. This is the half back stitch, and this is the pick stitch. And it's kind of ridiculous for me that I used a permanent marker to actually draw my lines instead of an erasable one. So if you can, I don't know if you can see that or not, the back stitch just looks like it's a straight stitch all the way down, but you can see my stitches in there every once in a while. And then of course you can see the back stitch where there's a space between all the stitches. And then the pick stitch is just I've just grabbed a little bit of the fabric. That's all you're going to see. And this is all on the face side, but I'm not going to draw the lines to indicate the face side so that it doesn't interfere with our stitching. So the pick stitch and the half back stitch you may see on a lot of like sport coats, men's or women's lapels will have these stitches. The full back stitch you might see if you're going to be hand stitching something together that's really thick, heavy fabric as a seam. So you wouldn't generally see this as like a top stitching where it would be visible, although I could see that we could have that on a top stitching as well. But these stitches actually come up more in tailoring, but I thought this would be a good time to actually break these out and do some exercises with them. So I'm going to actually, before I overlock, I'll go ahead and draw the lines here so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to be drawing 3 lines just to give me a guideline of where I'm stitching. So let me see, how wide is this? Okay, 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the middle, and these are 3 inches, so half of 3 inches is 1.5 inches. So there, all my stitches will be fairly even. And then I'm just going to draw the line. And the line is just so that I'm stitching on a fairly straight line. And then when we press this nice, all of these lines will go away, and we'll just have our pretty stitching. I'm going to go in an inch, I think, from either end. That way it'll keep it nice, right? So I'll start at one of these ends and I'll hand stitch along this line for each of the different styles of stitches, and then I'll label them, of course, what they are here. That was something I failed to do on this one, but I think I'm going to go back and do that. Okay, so I'll tell you what, I'm going to go and overlock these edges, and if you would like to do the same, we'll do that, and then we'll be right back here, and I will begin the tutorial for the back stitch, the half back stitch, and the pick stitch. Okay, so we're going to work on some hand stitches, and these particular hand stitches are mostly for decorative purposes, but they can be used for helping you to seam together some difficult parts of garments that you might be working with. So we're going to do a back stitch, a half back stitch, and a pick stitch. So I have my 2 pieces of fabric, and you could pin around. Maybe I'll go back and pin around so you can see me with the pinning it, and then that will keep the 2 pieces together while we're working with it. I've already drawn the lines for where my stitches are going to go, and these lines are drawn in erasable ink. But the names of the stitches are actually in permanent ink, so that when I press this for a final press, I still have the names of the stitches. So I've got my hand sewing needles, and if you watch the supplies video, then you know that I'm using size 7, but of course you can also use a size 9, that would be fine. And these ones are called sharps, so you're going to need a sharps needle size 7 or 9. And I'm going to use a threader. I've got my snips, and I'm going to need some thread. And I'm also going to actually use a ruler and my erasable pen, and that's just to mark where my stitching is. Now, when you're actually working with something, you probably won't mark, but the reason I'm going to mark is so that I get the stitches consistent, and I'll explain that once we get to the stitches. So the first thing we need to do is to thread the needle. Okay, so I'm going to thread my needle. This is right here. The eye is right up here. Oh, that's hard to see, but I'm going to actually use the needle threader. And so what I need to do is I need to look at the eye, and I'm going to pierce that eye with the tip of the threader, and then just gently push that through the eye. Right? And there you kind of see the opening of the needle threader. Now I'm going to set this down for just a sec. And then I'm going to take my thread, and I'm going to cut off a length of thread maybe 12 to 14 inches. When you cut your thread for sewing, you don't want a really long thread because it will tangle up on you. Okay, so, and we're just going to use one strand of the thread. We're not going to double it up. So we're just going to be using one strand of thread. Okay, so now all I need to do is I've got my needle with the needle threader through, and really all I need to do is put the thread through that eye of the needle threader, and then I can pull the thread with the needle threader straight through. Okay, and now on this tail here, this short tail that you see, you really want to only leave 3 to 6 inches long, because that tail is going to actually just make it so that the thread stays through the eye. So we'll just kind of have to keep an eye on that. We don't want to do double thread on this because it will cause the thread to tangle, and then you'll have kind of a mess. So let's keep it simple. So that's threading the needle. Okay, so now that we have the needle threaded, we actually need to tie a knot on the opposite end to keep it from going all the way through the fabric. So there's a tailor method where you wrap the thread around your finger, and then you kind of scoot the thread off of your finger, roll it off of your finger, and it makes a knot. So let me see if I can walk you through that. So I'm hanging the thread on my finger here. If it's gonna go over, you need a short end here. Make sure you have like a short end. Let me just show you how much there. And then I'm gonna wrap the thread around my finger. Now the idea here is that this short end, if you can see that, no, my fingers are in the way. That short end is gonna be going over on the opposite side of that thread you wrapped your finger around. And then when you roll it off of your finger, that tail is what you grab onto to tie the knot. And that didn't go very well. Again, I've got that thread holding it, wrapping it around, that other thread passing past your loop there that you wrapped around, and then you're rolling it off of your finger, and you're going to grab that. That one came off a little bit better. Let's see if I can do it again. So you can see that. Short tail, wrap it around your finger, and let me hold this here so you can see. So this tail here, you're gonna make sure that it goes on the opposite side of where you just wrapped the thread, and then when you roll your thread off, that tail comes onto the inside of that loop, which actually makes the knot. So once you get really good at this, you just kind of wrap it and then it rolls off and then you pull the knot. Something like that. That one's a little bit messy. If you can't do that, then of course you can just wrap it around your finger and then push that end through the hole and make that knot, right? And we only really need one. If you feel like your thread is too thin, then go ahead and wrap another knot and then slide the thread until it comes on top of that knot and you make a double knot, okay? Okay, so now that we have the needle threaded and I've got a knot here on my end, there's one other thing that I would like to mention, and that's thread conditioner. So I'm using this. I've had this for a long time. The newer ones kind of have a round package, but what it is this one is silicone. It's kind of messy and ugly in here. I've had this forever. And what this does is it actually conditions the thread from knotting and tangling. You may also have heard beeswax, which is a big yellow cylindrical piece of wax, which you will drag your thread through. Now, if you're using beeswax, you'll have to wax up the thread, and then you'll have to use a paper towel or something and actually press the wax into the thread. This particular thread conditioner is silicone, and so you don't need to actually press it. And I'm press it with the iron afterward to get the wax in it. So this is silicone, and what I'm doing is I'm just pulling the thread through it a few times. I'm pushing into the silicone and pulling that out, I think. And what this does is that you can feel it puts kind of like a waxy feel to the thread, and what that does is it helps it glide through the fabric a lot better, and of course helps with tangling and knotting while you sew. So that's a good idea to use thread conditioner. Beeswax or other silicone thread conditioner will be good, and just make sure that it's in there and you can feel how silky it is after that. Okay, so now we're actually ready to start stitching. Okay, so we're ready to stitch, and I'm going to start with the back stitch. And you can see here on my piece of fabric that I went ahead and put pins on the top and the bottom, and that's just to keep the two pieces from moving around on me. So what I'm going to do before I start stitching is I'm going to mark off how wide I want my stitches to be. And that's just so you can see how even your stitches should be when you're working them. And if you're a beginner, you may want to do this so that you start conditioning yourself for your eye, conditioning your eye so you know how wide your stitches are going to be. So that, you know, once you have done this a little bit, you don't actually need to mark anymore. And I'm marking 1/4 inch marks. Those may seem like short stitches, but this is usually about the size of the stitches that we would want. Okay, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and do this on all of these stitches, just so I don't have to do it for everything else. Now I've only marked half of the length, and that's because after here we want to start practicing on how even our stitches are. All right, so let's get started with the back stitch. So the way this is going to work, we're going to pretend this is the face side of the garment. So under here is going to be the wrong side. So when we first start this stitch, we actually want to come up from behind into this position, not here at the beginning, because our back stitch is that we're working on back stitching. So we're always going back to go forward. So we need to go back to go forward. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to feel where that beginning is and come up on that line to where my mark is, right? And it's all the way through. And all I need to do is just pull that thread, pull it gently, and then you'll feel the knot. Don't pull the knot all the way through. Now that we've got that, what we're going to do is we're going to do the back stitch, and we're going to go into the beginning and then all the way through, pull that all the way through, and just make sure it's snug. Okay, so there's our first stitch. Now I can show you on the back side what it looks like, and it's just coming up from the front. So now our next stitch, we're going to come from behind and we're going to come up into this position. So to my next mark. And pull up. And just pull it gently. Make sure it's snug. Let's have a look at the back side. So now this stitch goes all the way across past where I actually started. And then we want to make sure that that is snug but not too tight. Okay. So I'm making it snug. Now my next stitch is going to start here where I first came up. So we're going to meet at that stitch, and I'm going to take that needle and just stab it right through the fabric at that point. All right. So now I have two stitches, and I've come up back to exactly where I started at that knot. We're going to repeat that process coming up from the back to come up into the third mark and up, and then we're going to go back into where we left off on the last stitch. And we'll continue to do this process all the way along. Now, the nice thing about a back stitch is that you can actually sew seams with this, and it has some flexibility to it. So if you are worried about stitching together maybe some fine fabrics in the sewing machine, this would be a great stitch to use to actually stitch those seams together. Also, because it has the flexibility, if you're working with heavier fabrics and you want to sew say like a sleeve, set in a sleeve, and you want a good seam on it, but you want to make sure that it still has the flexibility, you could use this to inset a sleeve and then go over it again with the machine. You could also use this as per the other stitches that we're going to do as a decorative stitch for the outside of garments. This would be a great stitch, say if you are doing something that is a deconstructed look and all of your seams are going to be part of the look, so your seams are on the outside. Instead of doing internal seams, you could use this as a hand stitch for those seams, and then you could use a contrasting thread color. That would look very nice. So I'm going to finish up some of these other, just up to the other markings, and then I will go on to the next stitch. once I get to this last stitch here, I will show you how to knot this. And we're going to do that on the wrong side of the fabric. And just a couple more stitches here. And this will be the last one that I do. I'll go back later and finish the entire line. So once we get to assessment, I'll have a whole line of stitches. Okay, so this is my last stitch. I'm going to stab through, and I'm going to leave it in the back. I'm going to turn this over, and here we are, right? I have some stitches here. We want to be careful not to over pull it. So this is what our line looks like now, and you can kind of see there is a lot of flexibility in there. What I want to do is on this back side, I'm just going to grab one little yarn in the fabric, okay? There's one little yarn so we don't see it on the underside. I'm going to pull through my thread, and then I'm going to come through, make sure I go through that knot. It looks like it was go through that knot, and then make sure that that is tied. And then I'll go ahead and trim, okay? And that should be good. We don't want a lot of extra bulk there. So that is the back stitch, and then later on I'll go fix that. Okay, so now let's work on the half back stitch. And the half back stitch is actually sewn the same way that the back stitch is, except there's going to be a space in between the stitches, the same length of the previous stitch. So we're going to start here at the beginning, the same spot that we started the back stitch. So again, I'm coming from behind, and I'm going to stab up through at that point. Okay. Pull through until you feel that knot. Now I'm going to pierce here. I'm back stitching to the very beginning of the line, and I'm going to go all the way through and pull that thread through. Now we're not going to come up here. That's for the back stitch. We're actually going to skip one of my marks and go to the next one. So we're going to come up underneath 2 marks away from the original stitch and pull that through. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go back into that second mark, and we're going to go in this way. So now there is a space between each of those stitches. Okay, so stitch, space, stitch, and you want it to be consistent. So the space is exactly the same length as your stitch. So when I come up from behind, I'm not going to come here. I'm going to skip a stitch and then come up here to this next one. Now this is a really great decorative stitch, especially for heavier, medium weight to heavy fabrics, or you could even do this in lightweight fabrics. You just have to be careful that you're not actually pulling the stitches too much. Again, I'm going to skip a stitch here, come up, and then go down into that skipped stitch. So this would be kind of a nice, maybe around the edge of a placket. If you had a shirt, this would be great for a placket. We're going to get to the pick stitch is something a little bit more decorative, but if you had a large garment like a coat, this would be a really nice stitch. So we're almost coming up to the end here. I'm going to do, I think I will just kind of eye this. I'm going to go down here. I think I'll end here because I don't have another mark here. And I think I'll end on that. And then I'll finish the rest later. So you're basically skipping one of the marks and then going back to it to get this half back stitch. Okay, so this is the back. This is what the back should look like. And we're just like we tied a knot here on the back stitch. I'm just gonna come here. I'm gonna grab one little yarn of the fabric, and I'm going to come under. I'm going to go ahead and grab that thread from the last stitch, pull this through, and then I'm going to insert my needle here to the thread to actually just tie a knot, which will hold on to that last stitch. And then I can actually just trim this off. All right, that looks pretty good. So that is our half back stitch. Okay, so now let's work on the pick stitch. And the pick stitch is very decorative. You may have seen it on the exterior of collars or lapels for suit coats. It's actually very nice, kind of gives it kind of a high-end look. It works actually very similar, except the fabric that we're going to be grabbing is going to be very tiny amounts. And we're going to be working on the top here. We won't be actually feeling like we're going under the fabric at all, except for the very first stitch. And we're going to start here at the very beginning. On the previous stitches, we started in one of the marks that I made, but we're actually going to start right here at the very beginning for our first stitch, and we're going to come from underneath. Okay? And pull that through until you hit that knot. Now, see if I can show you a little bit here. What's going to happen is you're going to come here and you're just going to take just a little bit of fabric. I want to say the measurement may be like a 32nd, but you're going to make sure that that needle goes all the way through the fabric. So you're picking up all the layers of the fabric, right? And so you're going to feel that, and you're just going to come back where that original stitch came out, right? And then go ahead and, that's not what we want to do. So come out, and then what you're going to do is take up a little amount of fabric, make sure that that needle goes all the way through, right? And instead of coming out where you went in, you're actually going to come out into the next mark. Okay, and you'll repeat that process. I'm going to take a little bit of fabric, go all the way through, and hit that next mark. Now the size of these, I'm going all the way through, piercing through. Let me unfold so you can see what's happening underneath. So my needle is right here and the stitches are going across. It actually looks like the back stitch on the wrong side, but on the top side we're just taking a little bit of fabric from where we originally came out and then moving the needle over there. Okay, so this is a really great decorative stitch for some high-end looks on your garments. So say you have a nice collar with a nice fine fabric, this would be really great in a contrasting. It just gives that little extra bit of interest. And just take a little bit, maybe you're going a couple of yarns in the fabric. And of course, the consistency is really important as well. So that's why I made the marks. So the more you do these stitches, the more you will get used to seeing what the amounts are. So I know I've done spaced these apart 1/4 of an inch, but of course you can do your spacing anything you want, 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. You could even do more, you could do a 1/2 inch. But understand if you're using a larger amount, especially with the back stitch, that your seams will not be as secure. And I'm coming up to just a couple more stitches. And this will be my last one. So instead of going through this one, instead of putting the needle through to a next stitch, I'm just going to put it down the same amount of fabric that I would have taken up. Pierce that through all the way. And underneath, here we are. That's what my pick stitch looks like. I'm going to finish this off the same way. Take a couple, just one yarn there underneath my last stitch. So so that I can create a loop knot. I've got going inside that loop, and then I can tie that knot. And I can clip that off. If you feel more secure, you could double knot it, but make sure that you're not creating any bulk. All right, so now we have completed the back stitch, the half back stitch, and the pick stitch. And I will complete the rest of these stitches for the assessment and of course give it one final press, and you'll be able to see all of that work.